The air above northern Hungary carried the scent of smoke and rain as István Szabó stared across the valley from the walls of Eger. A sea of red tents stretched endlessly, their banners flickering like tongues of fire in the wind. He could almost taste the silence before battle, that sharp metallic stillness that comes before blood is spilled. 2,000 men, women, and boys stood behind him, armed with more courage than steel. Beyond the fields, 40,000 Ottomans waited to erase them from the map. Gergely Bornemisa joined him on the battlement, soot on his face from the forges. "They'll be ready by sunrise," he said. Szabó nodded. "So will we." In the courtyards below, blacksmiths worked through the night, hammering pikes and arrowheads from scrap. Women filled cauldrons with water and oil, stoking fires until the flames turned the sky orange. Priests carried powder barrels instead of books. Even the old men hauled stones to the parapets. When dawn came, the valley trembled under the beat of Ottoman drums. Cannons rolled forward like beasts on chains, their wheels biting deep into the earth. The first shot struck the outer wall, shaking dust from the towers. The defenders didn't flinch. They had spent all night boiling their answer. The ground shook as ladders slammed against the walls. Janissaries in iron helmets surged upward, shouting war cries that drowned the wind. Szabó's voice cut through the chaos, steady, unbroken. "Pour!" he commanded. Scalding water cascaded through the murder holes, steam bursting into clouds that hid the carnage. Men screamed and fell, armor hissing as if alive. Stones followed, crushing those beneath. Firepots shattered against shields, spreading rivers of flame through the ranks. The enemy climbed again, and again they were thrown back. Eger's towers became furnaces. The farmers fought like wolves, cornered in their own den. Every blow was survival, every heartbeat a defiance of logic. As the sun dropped below the hills, the ground beneath the walls was littered with bodies and broken ladders. The Ottomans withdrew into the smoke, dragging their wounded behind them. Szabó watched the retreat from the ramparts. His people were blackened by soot, blistered by heat, but their eyes burned brighter than the fires around them. "They'll come again," Bornemisa said. Szabó sheathed his sword. "Then we'll boil more water." When the next dawn came, the drums started earlier, angrier. The Ottomans had repaired their siege towers during the night. Their patience burned away. From every hill, their banners rose like a red tide. Eger's bells answered them, ringing not for prayer, but defiance. The defenders moved as one body. Farmers turned soldiers, women turned warriors, their exhaustion buried beneath stubborn pride. The cannons opened fire. Stone splintered, towers shuddered. A section of wall collapsed in a roar, and the invaders charged through the breach. Szabó met them head-on, sword flashing in the smoke. Arrows hissed past his face as he cut through the first wave. Behind him, peasants, armed with pitchforks and mallets, fought like men possessed. "Hold the gap!" he shouted. "No step back!" From the inner yard, Gergely's contraptions roared to life. Barrels packed with powder and scrap rolled downhill toward the enemy. They exploded among the ranks, hurling debris and fire. The Ottomans faltered, but their numbers seemed endless. For every man who fell, 2 more climbed the ruins. Above the breach, women dumped boiling pitch that clung to armor like tar. One young girl carried buckets up and down the stairs until her hands bled. Her mother joined her, face streaked with ash, eyes fierce. Together, they poured another cauldron down the wall, screaming at the attackers to come closer. The Ottomans reached the courtyard, only to find the defenders waiting. Spears thrust, blades flashed, and the farmers of Eger fought in the mud among shattered masonry. The clang of steel on steel echoed like thunder. Then, as the sky dimmed, a horn blew from the Ottoman camp. Retreat. Szabó leaned on his sword, chest heaving. The courtyard stank of smoke and iron. Around him, men wept, laughed, prayed, or simply collapsed. The fortress had lost part of its wall, but not its soul. "They'll never stop," Bornemisa said. Szabó looked to the burning horizon. "Neither will we." Days turned to weeks, each one marked by thunder from the hills and the answering roar of Eger's guns. Smoke clung to the fortress like a living thing, seeping into every stone. The defenders no longer counted time in hours, but in cannon blasts. At night, they slept where they fell, wrapped in soot and exhaustion. When dawn came, they rose again to fight. The Ottomans grew restless. Their camp stretched for miles, a city of silk and misery. Supplies ran thin, tempers shorter still. Yet Ali Pasha demanded victory. He ordered a new assault, the fiercest yet. Hundreds of ladders were readied, siege towers patched and painted black to hide the scorch marks. Drums rolled like thunder over the valley as the Sultan's men marched once more toward the smoking walls. Inside the fortress, Istvan Dobo stood atop the gatehouse, eyes narrowed. He could feel the tremor in the ground as tens of thousands advanced. His men waited behind barricades of rubble and furniture. Buckets of boiling water lined the walls. Pitch fires blazed, fed by every scrap of wood they could find. Women prayed between trips up the battlements, clutching rosaries with hands raw from heat. Then, with a single command from below, the Ottomans surged forward. Arrows filled the air. Siege towers groaned as they rolled into range. The sky turned black with smoke and dust. Dobo shouted for the signal, and Gurgly Bornemisa lit his final surprise. Barrels of oil and powder hidden beneath the outer wall. The explosion ripped through the air, toppling the nearest tower in a shower of fire and splinters. Still, they came. The ladders hit the walls, and the defenders met them with boiling fury. Water, oil, and molten pitch rained down in sheets. The sound was sickening, metal sizzling, men screaming, steam hissing like serpents. Bees were flung from the towers in clay pots, bursting open to unleash chaos on the packed soldiers below. Swarms enveloped the attackers, stinging through armor and cloth alike. For a moment, the battlefield was madness. Fire, smoke, insects, blood, all one blur of noise and terror. Dobo shouted until his throat tore, calling his men to hold the line. They did. Every man, woman, and child on the walls became a weapon. The invaders broke against them like waves against stone. When at last the horn of retreat sounded, the plain before Eger was carpeted in bodies and wreckage. The Ottomans limped back to their camp, banners torn, engines burning. The defenders stood in silence, barely able to comprehend what they had done. 2,000 had faced 40,000, and still the walls held. Dobo looked to the horizon, where the enemy fires flickered weaker than before. "They've learned," he said quietly. "Eger isn't a fortress. It's a furnace." Bornemisza smiled, weary and wild. "And we've kept it burning." Night fell heavy and cruel, pressing down on the blackened walls of Eger. The defenders no longer spoke of victory, only endurance. Their food was nearly gone, powder low, and every stone tower bore the scars of fire. The wounded groaned in the halls, priests whispering prayers over the dying, yet no one fled, no one begged for mercy. The fortress breathed defiance. Dobo walked the ramparts, a ghost among the flames. The enemy camp below shimmered with torchlight, a restless hive preparing for one last strike. He could hear distant chanting, the solemn rhythm of men steeling themselves for death or glory. His own people listened to the same drums and felt no fear. Only a grim calm. In the dark, Bornemisza joined him, carrying a broken sword. "They'll come again before sunrise," he said. Dobo didn't look away from the valley. "Let them. This night will break them, or us." The air smelled of rain and blood when the assault began. The first cannonball smashed into the north wall, shaking the fortress awake. Torches flared, horns blared, and once again the valley roared with war. Thousands of Ottomans surged forward, their cries rising like a storm. Ladders slammed against the walls, rams battered the gate, and arrows filled the air like rain. The defenders moved as though born for this moment. Women hauled buckets up the towers, dumping boiling water through the slits. Men rolled logs into the masses below, crushing anyone who climbed too high. The air filled with screams and steam. A priest was struck by an arrow. Yet even as he fell, he poured the last pot of pitch on a ladder full of attackers. At the gate, Dobo himself stood in the breach. His sword was black with blood, his armor dented and scorched. "Push," he roared, and his men obeyed. The Ottomans poured through the splintered opening, but the defenders met them with fury. Spears thrust, axes swung, and the narrow path became a graveyard. Then the sky broke. Thunder cracked, and rain came down in torrents, turning the battlefield to mud. Fires hissed out, smoke twisting into the storm. The defenders laughed, half mad, half divine, as the rain cooled their burns and turned their boiling water into a flood that swept down the walls. The Ottomans stumbled, shields slipping, boots sinking into the mire. By dawn, the last assault had failed. The valley was silent, save for the cries of the wounded. The great red banners lay trampled in the mud. When the sun finally rose, it revealed the unthinkable. Ager still stood. Dobo leaned against the gate, sword hanging loose in his hand. Around him, his people wept and embraced, their faces streaked with soot and tears. He looked out over the valley, where the enemy camp was already retreating, and spoke softly, almost to himself. 40,000 came for us, he said, and left with nothing. Bornemissa stood beside him, exhausted but smiling. Except a story, he said, one they'll never forget. The sun rose, slow and gold, over a land reborn in smoke. The valley that had been filled with thunder was now a graveyard. Silent, but for the crows circling overhead. Broken ladders, burned siege towers, and rusting armor littered the fields where an empire's pride had come to die. Inside the fortress, the survivors of Ager gathered by the shattered gate, staring at the ruins of the Ottoman host as if afraid it might be a dream. Dobo removed his helmet and set it aside. His hair was streaked with ash, his eyes hollow from nights without sleep. Yet there was a strange peace in his expression. "They're gone," Bornemissa said, voice hoarse. "Truly gone." Dobo nodded. "For now." The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, listening to the wind sweep through the empty fields. By noon, word spread like wildfire. Messengers rode out from the fortress to every corner of Hungary, shouting the impossible. Ager still held. Villages that had been braced for Ottoman conquest rang church bells until the ropes tore. Farmers left their plows to look north, whispering prayers of thanks. The legend began before the smoke had even cleared. Inside the fortress walls, the dead were carried to the courtyard. Priests chanted among the bodies, blessing heroes who had been farmers only weeks before. Women scrubbed the stones clean of blood, their faces calm but unbroken. Children played beside the cauldrons that had saved them, now cold and blackened with soot. Dobo moved among his people, offering words that felt too small for what they had done. "You've earned the right to rest," he told them. "The world will know your names." A young boy, no older than 12, looked up from scrubbing the rampart and asked, "Will they come again?" Dobo placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe, but they will remember what waits for them here." As night fell, torches flickered along the ramparts one last time. The defenders gathered at the top of the main tower, overlooking the valley where 40,000 soldiers had once stood. The stars returned to the sky, free of smoke. Someone began to sing, a low, weary tune that grew until every voice joined in. Ager had not only survived, it had become immortal. The boiling water, the beehives, the firepots, the courage, all of it forged into a legend that would echo through centuries. Bornemissa looked to the horizon and whispered, "They came to crush us. Instead, we baptized them in fire." Dobo smiled faintly, and history will remember that the people of Ager were never conquered. The victory at Ager spread faster than any army. Across the Carpathian Basin, peasants and nobles alike spoke the name of the fortress in reverence. Travelers brought tales to every market square, how the farmers of Ager had poured boiling water on the might of the Sultan, how women fought like furies, how the smoke of defiance had risen so thick it could be seen from the next province. The story grew in the telling, as legends do, but at its core remained something unshakably true. Courage had triumphed over calculation. In Buda, the Ottoman generals whispered of witchcraft. They claimed that the defenders had been aided by spirits, or that the rain itself had turned against them. To admit that peasants had defeated them with pots and stones was unthinkable. Yet the truth reached Constantinople, where even the Sultan was said to have frowned and ordered the defeat never spoken of in his court. For Hungary, Ager became more than a fortress. It became the heartbeat of a wounded nation. The people who had lived for decades under fear now had a story to hold on to, proof that the empire could bleed. Songs were written, prayers composed, and every child learned the names of Dobo and Bornemissa. In taverns, old men would tap their mugs together and say, "Boil the water, boys. That's how you stop an empire." Years passed, and the fortress was rebuilt stone by stone. The scars of cannon fire were never fully erased, and perhaps that was fitting. Each mark was a reminder of those who had refused to kneel. Debo was hailed as a hero, yet he never called himself one. When asked how they had won, he answered simply, "We believed we could not lose." Bornemisa turned his talents to invention, designing new defenses and strange machines that carried the lessons of Ager into the next generation. He said that war was not won by strength, but by imagination, and the day the farmers picked up boiling cauldrons proved it. In time, the Ottoman tide rolled forward again, swallowing cities and fortresses. But never Ager. Even when the Turks finally conquered much of Hungary, the memory of that single stand burned like a coal beneath the ashes. It became a symbol whispered in uprisings, a rallying cry whenever the land was threatened. Centuries later, when the Hungarian flag once more rose free, it was said that the spirit of Ager had marched with every patriot who carried it. The people remembered that they were descended from those who had fought not for kings or crowns, but for the soil beneath their feet. At the ruins of the old fortress, where ivy crept over blackened stone, a small inscription was carved into the wall. It read, "Here stood 2,000 souls, and no empire could move them." Years turned the legend into a lesson. The siege of Ager became a symbol in academies and battlefields alike, studied as a masterwork of resolve. Across Europe, commanders traced its blueprints and whispered its name before hopeless battles. They spoke of it not as myth, but as proof that the will to resist could outweigh the might to conquer. The Ottoman chroniclers, shamed but honest, called it the fortress that refused the laws of war. Historians called it the boiling miracle. Time passed, and Bornemisa, now an old man, returned to the fortress one autumn afternoon when the leaves turned the hills crimson and gold. The air was still, save for the whisper of wind through the battlements. The scars of war were carved deep into the stone, cracks from cannonballs, blackened streaks from fire, but the walls still stood. He walked slowly along the ramparts, hand brushing the cold stone, and every step brought back the roar of that terrible siege. He could still see Dobo on the tower, cloak torn, sword raised against the tide. He could still hear the women shouting as they poured boiling oil onto the ladders, could smell the mingled stench of pitch, blood, and victory. A group of children followed him, wide-eyed and curious. They had grown up on the stories of Ager, tales told by grandfathers who had not been there but spoke as though they had. One boy pointed to the towers and asked, "Is it true, sir, that you burned 40,000 of them with water?" Bornemisa smiled faintly. "Not water alone," he said. "Fire, faith, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know when to die." He looked out towards the valley, where grass now covered the graves of the fallen. "We weren't heroes, boy. We were hungry and scared, but we had nowhere left to run." The boy frowned. "Then why did you win?" The old engineer turned to face him. "Because we decided that the walls weren't stone. They were us. And as long as one of us stood, the fortress did too." Centuries later, a historian named Marton Kovács stood in the archives of Budapest, brushing dust from a stack of yellowed papers. They were letters, brittle, water-stained, written in the hand of those who had stood at Ager. Some were from soldiers to their wives, others from priests describing miracles in the smoke, and one, signed by István Dobó himself, was a simple note that read, "If the walls fall, we will build them again with our bodies." Marton stared at the line for a long time. It was not the words of a noble or a scholar, but of a man who understood that history bends not to kings, but to the stubborn courage of the ordinary. He realized then that Ager's defense was not just a Hungarian legend. It was a mirror for every struggle where the few faced the many and refused to yield. He traveled north to the fortress itself. Tourists murmured around him as guides retold the familiar story. How boiling water turned the tide, how 2,000 farmers stopped an empire. Martin climbed to the highest tower and looked down at the quiet valley, the same one that had once burned with fire and fury. He imagined those long dead defenders standing where he now stood, staring into a storm that should have destroyed them. He wondered if they knew What they were building was not just survival, but legacy, that their stand would become proof that even when numbers, power, and logic say impossible, humanity's will can still shout, "Try me." The wind swept through the battlements, carrying the distant sound of church bells from the town below. Martin smiled, set down his notebook, and whispered what all who come to Ager eventually say: "You were never conquered." The fortress stood silent in reply, but the stones seemed to hum with life. Beneath centuries of weather and war, Ager still spoke, a quiet voice reminding the world that courage needs no crown, no banner, and no army. It only needs fire. And, in that moment, standing where heroes once boiled water into legend, Martin understood that the true story of Ager was not how it survived, but how it taught the world to stand.